Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana. My name is Marion Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film that examines Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis and the ways in which it affects our communities, industries, and culture. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to launch this podcast series that will continue to explore issues facing the Louisiana coast through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. On this episode, we're speaking with Bren Haase, Board Chairman for the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority in Louisiana. And now, our interview with Bren Haase. Well, thank you for joining us today, Bren.
Happy to be here.
So, for people who may not know, can you briefly tell us what is the CPRA and what role does it serve for the state of Louisiana?
Yeah, so CPRA is the state entity that's responsible for developing and implementing a master plan for a sustainable coast. So we develop a long-term plan, kind of an outlook for our coast. It's a 50-year outlook. It's our coastal master plan. And out of that plan are, obviously projects are identified and priorities for our coast. It's kind of a single vision for our coast that the state, parishes, national organizations, the federal government all can get behind and allow us all to sort of sing from the same sheet of music in terms of what we want to do along our coast. And then we put those things on the ground, we build them.
Yeah, and so tell me a little bit about what is the process for putting that master plan together? How do you get all these different groups to kind of come together on this one plan?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are obviously lots of interests, lots of varied opinions about what needs to be done for the coast. But I think one thing about the coastal issue to me that I think is really interesting is that there's 100% agreement that something needs to be done. There's nobody, I don't think, in the state of Louisiana, certainly along the coast, that thinks we can afford to just sit back and not try to do anything about it. So the master plan is it's a living document. It's something that we're required to update. It used to be every 5 years. It's now every 6 years. And so we have just in 2023 produced our fourth master plan. And so we've developed quite a process, I guess, for getting through that. And it's very much grounded in science and engineering about what's going on along our coast. So the science of the marshes, the science of our swamps, our barrier islands, and so forth, and then what we think we can do from an engineering perspective to help rebuild and restore those. And so that's sort of the basis of it, but that has got to be informed and has got to be fed by public input as well. And so the master plan is a few things. It's as I mentioned, it's a way to make hard decisions in a resource-constrained kind of world. We don't have all the money, we don't have all the sediment, we don't have all the natural, other natural resources, fresh water and so forth, to do everything we want along our coast. So it's a framework for making those decisions in that constrained environment. It's a list of projects, but it's also an engagement process. And so we've got lots and lots, and I won't bore you with all the numbers, but literally hundreds of touch points with groups along our coast, stakeholders, communities, parishes, native tribes, and so forth, all across the coast that have input in the master plan and are able to really get a look behind the curtain in terms of the technical process of developing it. But sometimes that technical process and the technical outcome might not meet the needs of everybody. And so we take that public input, it sort of adjusts, and it's a lens through which we look at kind of the technical output of things. And at the end of the day, if somebody, a group, or sort of the coastal stakeholders as a whole are not interested in project X, they want project Y, we can do that, but we can demonstrate through kind of the technical tools that we have what that means for our coast. Is it more sustainable, less sustainable? Do you trade, one resource off for another, that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing that you can bring so many different groups and people together for this one plan, and get everyone to kind of buy in and feel a part of it. It is.
It's quite interesting, I guess, kind of from the inside looking out. I mentioned this is the fourth iteration of our master plan. So each master plan is approved through the legislatures, through the state legislature, and all of them have been approved unanimously. And I'm sure maybe there's another issue that gets that kind of bipartisan support, but but I'm not aware of it if there is. I mean, if you think about a plan that's contemplating, a 50-year outlook for the coastal Louisiana, expending about $50 billion over that period of time to receive unanimous support through a political body is just almost unheard of. So there's a lot of consensus, and a lot of folks, really, again, almost unanimous. Everybody understands that we've got to do something along our coast, or our future will be pretty bleak.
Right. So you've been working in coastal restoration for a long time now.
Mm-hmm.
How did you originally get into this field? Did you kind of grow up around nature? Were you always kind of interested in that?
Yeah, I did. From a young boy, spent a lot of time in the outdoors. Always been interested in really interested in nature, and interested in Louisiana's coast in particular, and wildlife, and really interested in how it worked. Why does how do the tides affect wildlife and fish and things like that, just that kind of stuff. And so from a young age, I spent a lot of time with my family and friends and so forth in the outdoors, fishing and hunting primarily, but and mostly along our coast, from Holly Beach in the west to Hopedale in the east. And so even as a much younger man and a child, I recognized how our coast was changing in just a matter of a year or two or three. I mean, you might go and fish in an area and come back in a year or two, and it could be vastly different from what it looked like, just a couple of years ago, because of the just the dynamic nature of our coast and the fact that we're losing so much of it. And so that really drove me to not only want to, I guess, kind of understand how our coast works and how kind of that ecosystem works, but then also want to be kind of a part of the solution for trying to maintain it, trying to keep it from being lost, and helping to restore it.
Right. It was like real to you. You could see it as a kid.
Yeah.
So, as you know, Louisiana recently broke ground on the Mid-Barataria sediment diversions.
Yeah.
What does that project mean for the Louisiana coast?
Well, I think it's really a transformational project for the coast. It's, it's something that anybody who spent any time, certainly around the river or where the river's connected to the coast, has seen. Maybe not everybody understands it, but areas south of Venice, for example, and south of kind of where the levees end along the Mississippi River that are still connected to the coast, are these healthy, vibrant, teeming with wildlife and fish and so forth kind of areas. The same thing you see in the Atchafalaya Basin and in the Wax Lake and the Atchafalaya Deltas as well, in the central portion of our coast. And so the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion is really intended to mimic Mother Nature, mimic what built coastal Louisiana in the first place. Literally, the ground that we're sitting on today was built by the Mississippi River and the power of it to move sediment, deposit sediment, and build up our coast. And so reconnecting the river with its ecosystem, with its estuary, with its coastal wetlands is a key in those master plans that we just discussed. In trying to not only rebuild our coastal wetlands, but also kind of reset the function, if you will, of the estuaries. And so when we leveed the Mississippi River, we, as I mentioned a moment ago, isolated it from its ecosystem. Historically, it wouldn't, in spring, it would flood. We're experiencing extremely low river right now, so we're not thinking about floods, we're thinking about a drought, but it's all part of the cycle of the river. And so in the spring, typically it would flood, overflow its sort of natural banks, and deposit sediments across large areas of coastal Louisiana. And over time, that builds up our land, coastal wetlands. But when we isolated the river, we interrupted that process. And so instead of going from a situation where we were gaining about a mile of land a year, we flipped that on its ear, and have been in a situation where we're losing anywhere from 15 to almost 30 square miles a year. So the idea is, again, to kind of reset the estuary, use the power of the river, use the power of Mother Nature to help rebuild and restore wetlands by delivering the sediment that, as it's done for eons, to our coast. It has the dual benefit also of benefiting the other projects that we're building in our ecosystems. So we do a lot of dredging, and a lot of folks say, well, why don't you just dredge? You don't need to, let the river go, essentially, and to do what you want to do. Well, Dredging's great. It's 99% of what we've done basically to date to help restore our coast, but it doesn't do anything to fundamentally change the causes of land loss in those areas that we're trying to restore. And so as soon as you walk away from a dredge marsh creation project, for example, it's starting to experience those same factors that cause that area to lose land in the first place, and it's starting to degrade. So not only can a diversion like the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion build its own wetlands and sustain wetlands that are already there, but it'll sustain those projects that we've built in those areas.
Right. And so what are some of the concerns that folks have about the effects of the diversions, and what is the CPRA doing to address those concerns?
Yeah, so the project's going to change things, and I guess kind of at its core, that's the issue when you're talking about change, right? That's a scary thing for all of us, and the perception is that that's change that's inflicted upon people, right, or imposed upon people because we are building this project. But the reality is that basin has been changing for the last 100 years. And it began again as we leveed the Mississippi River, locked it in place, and eliminated the annual floods that would typically happen. So the basin's been changing. It's not been changing for the good. We've got all kinds of issues within that basin. Land loss, we've got increased tidal amplitudes. It's coming up and down much more frequently. We've got communities that are on sinking land. They're flooding more often today without a diversion in place because of prolonged south winds and things that 10, 20, 30 years ago never would have been an issue for many of these communities. We see fisheries, obviously, that are not doing well because of the loss of habitat. We've got issues with speckled trout, flounder, redfish right now that are being discussed in terms of modified creel and size limits and so forth for those. And none of those are because of the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion. It's not on the ground right now. While the concern is that if this project is implemented, it is going to change the basin, and I understand that that's the concern. The point of the project is to change the basin. The point of the project is, in fact, that change. Because if we don't change what's going on in the basin right now, many of the things that people are concerned with the project in place are coming. In fact, many of them are already here. We're already experiencing those, increased flooding events and so forth, increased impacts from hurricanes and tropical storms, some of the fisheries impacts that I just mentioned. So the good news is that with the project in place, we have a plan to try to address some of those concerns. So there's close to $400 million worth of mitigation that will be done for communities that are currently outside of flood risk reduction features, for example, that are experiencing that flooding right now. When we introduce water into this basin, of course, and sediment, it will increase water levels somewhat. But we're able to address that through features specific to each of these communities, whether it's bulkheads or raising roads or raising homes, things of that nature, that are not only going to address kind of the impacts associated with the project, but again, some of those impacts that are being experienced today, without that project in place. There's concerns about the shrimp and oyster fisheries, of course, within the basin as well. And look, I want to be clear. We love shrimp. We love oysters. We want to see those things. I want to be able to go get an oyster po' boy when I want to at a reasonable price. And so, there are plans in place as well to provide assistance to those shrimpers and those oyster people that are harvesting oysters to help them transition to a basin that's changing, perhaps in the opposite direction that it's changing now. Folks are harvesting oysters and catching speckled trout in areas where their fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and mothers did not in the past. And so again, this is the project will sort of reset, I think, kind of the estuary, and there's still going to be oysters in the basin. There'll still be shrimp around, and they might not be in the same places as they are today, but we believe there'll be viable fisheries along coastal Louisiana for years to come, and to the degree that we can assist in some of the that transition and the changes within the basin, that's what we're trying to do.
Right. It's an interesting point. It's kind of like the change is inevitable. It's like, how are you going to deal with it?
It is. I mean, we have, and look, I say this a lot. Some folks have heard me say it a lot, I guess, but we have a choice in coastal Louisiana. We have a question we need to ask ourselves. Do we allow the change that has been occurring for the last 100 years to inflict its will on us, essentially, to dictate where we can fish, where we can make a living, where we can live? Or do we try to manage that for the most good, for sustainable coastal Louisiana, for the most communities across coastal Louisiana? That's really the idea behind the master plan. We've made that second choice. We want to manage that change as best we can, so that we have a sustainable future for ourselves and for our children and for our grandchildren.
Yeah. So what are some of the lessons or the takeaways that you've learned over the course of your career, working on the coast?
Well, I'll go back to that word change again. Yeah. That's almost always a scary thing for folks to contemplate, and I get it. It's scary for me as well. I think kind of the biggest lesson I've learned is that you have to have folks involved in the decisions that are being made, and you've got to have a real ability for folks to have meaningful input into those decisions. Things can't be done in a vacuum. If they do, you lose credibility, you lose trust. It's just not a good way to go about things. And so the more folks that you can bring under the tent and understand kind of the process and have input in decisions that are being made and what projects are being built and why are we doing this here and there instead of there and here, the better off you are.
Right. Everyone feels like they're a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you for talking to me today, Bren. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. We appreciate your interest and enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Bren Haase. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can also watch a video version of this podcast on YouTube, which you can find a link to in the description. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through grant funds from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and is executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.